We three kings of Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon. And we are picking back up. We're going to pick back up in 1 Samuel chapter 13, starting in verse 15. So let's take a look, first of all, at what just happened, right? We have this lack of faith shown in Saul's life. This stumbling where he didn't wait, where he should have waited on Samuel, and he ended up offering a sacrifice that he had no business offering. Samuel finally comes right at the time he's offering the sacrifice and says, "What are you doing?" And God basically says, "Look, if you can't trust me and listen to me and do what I say, I can't continue the kingdom with you. I can't continue it with you." So Samuel says, God is no longer going to choose you and your lineage for the kingdom. He would have established it forever, but because of your sin, he can no longer do that. So we pick it back up. We move to we ended at verse 14 last time, where that's exactly what Samuel said. "Now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." Verse 15, Samuel rose up and went from Gilgal. The rest of the people went up after Saul to meet the army. They went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. And Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. Okay, remember, there were 330,000 in the previous victory that they had that came with Saul. And this time, there were about 600 men. The people had started scattering from him. So before we get too judgmental on Saul and what he did in offering the sacrifice and seeking the Lord, remember, people were scattering from him left and right. 7 days he's waiting for Samuel. Samuel hadn't come. I got to be honest, I think I'd probably be in the same sort of situation. I'd be in that same boat. I'd be full of fear. I'd be worrying. I'd be saying, what is going on? What needs to happen? But still, he had no business sacrificing the sacrifice that he did. He had no business doing what he did. But about 600 men are with him. All that to say, there's a lot of people that had left, right? A lot of people had fled. So Saul and Jonathan, his son, and the people who were present with them stayed in Gibeah of Benjamin, but the Philistines encamped at Michmash. And raiders came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned toward Ophrah to the land of Shual. Another company turned toward Beth-horon, and another company turned toward the border that looks down on the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. So 3 companies of the Philistines start spreading out. There's going to be a lot of scripture reading in this one, which is good. Then you don't have to hear my own opinions as much. Verse 19, "Now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel. For the Philistines said, 'Lest the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears.' No blacksmith to be found in Israel. But every one of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, or his sickle. The charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares, for the mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening the axes and for setting the goads." So there are no spears, right? So on the day of battle, there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people with Saul and Jonathan, but Saul and Jonathan, his son, had them. So there was at least that, right? 2 people versus all the garrison of the Philistines, right? The garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. So there are really no weapons to speak of. You have the mattocks, you have the axes, you have things like that were really agricultural tools, but those were what the people had to fight with. They didn't have spears, they didn't have swords, and they're up against chariots, they're up against myriad of Philistines out here. Everything looks very, very dire for them. I mean, they are unarmed. Let's take a look and see what happens coming into chapter 14 here. "So one day, Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, 'Come, let's go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side.' But he didn't tell his father." Okay. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave at Migron. The people who were with him were about 600 men, including Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. And the people didn't know that Jonathan had gone. Okay, one note here is that this lineage, this person from the lineage of Eli, was still serving as priest to Saul as well. Now, maybe this happened after Samuel left and Saul was looking for someone in the priestly lineage to come to him. But remember, the Lord had pronounced a judgment on Eli because of his sons, Hophni and Phinehas. So not only of the lineage of Eli, but also of the lineage of Phinehas. And yet he's still serving Saul as a priest. I don't know that Saul wouldn't know. I would imagine Saul would have known about this lineage and probably shouldn't have used him, but he still was using him as a priest. So that aside, we'll move forward here. So in verse 4, well, into verse 3, the people didn't know that Jonathan had gone, right? So Jonathan left with his armor bearer. Within the passes bearer, not bear, armor bearer, that would be a pretty good weapon if you had an armor bearer to go with you. But he didn't. He had an armor bearer. Sorry. Verse 4, chapter 14. Within the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a rocky crag on one side and a rocky crag on the other side. The name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other Seneh. Yeah, the one crag rose on the north in front of Michmash, and the other on the south in front of Geba. So there's Rocky Crag over here, there's Rocky Crag over here, right? So there's got to be a place in the middle that's going that way, probably like a valley or something like that in between the two Rocky Crags. The image that comes up here kind of seems like they may be on one Rocky Crag, and then the Philistine, the garrison on the other Rocky Crag. You'll see kind of how that comes about in just a minute here. Continuing on, Jonathan said to the young man, verse 6, who carried his armor, "Come, let's go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." That's some good faith right there. I mean, that is some good trust in the Lord by Jonathan, saying it doesn't matter. Even if it's just us two, God can save. If it's just the 300 or 600 that were with Saul and Jonathan at the time, God can still save us. Because it's God. Nothing can hinder the Lord. If that's what he decides to do, then he'll decide to do it. So verse 7, his armor bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Do as you wish. Behold, I am with you, heart and soul." That kind of sounds a little bit like do what your hand finds to do, for God is with you. That's the advice Saul still should have been taking at the time. Then Jonathan said, "Behold, we will cross over to the men, and we will show ourselves to them. If they say to us, 'Wait until we come to you,' then we will stand in our place, and we will not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hand, and this will be the sign to us." So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines. Verse 11, they both showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines. Where are we here? Yes, verse 11. And the Philistines said, "Look, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves." Now the Philistines had a habit, as we'll see more and more, of really just going after and annoying and cutting down the Hebrews, the Jewish people. I mean, insults galore and just ragging on them constantly while they're being a bully. And I mean, it's more than just being a bully. Look, in America, we have bullies, and they might pick on you at school and all that kind of stuff, but they were being oppressed. The Israelites were being oppressed. Make no mistake about it. No weapons to be found. The Philistines would not make them weapons or sharpen their weapons, and they were going to be making fun of them and insulting them the whole time anyway, despite the fact that they had a leg up on them, period, the whole time. So verse 12, the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, "Come up to us, and we will show you a thing." Again, kind of goading them, right? Come on. And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, and his armor bearer after him. So it seems like they had to climb up this rocky crag. It seems like, right? So his armor bearer came up after them. And then verse 13, And they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed them after him. So Jonathan strikes them. His armor bearer comes and finishes the final blow off. Verse 14, and that first strike, which Jonathan and his armor bearer made, killed about 20 men within, as it were, half a furrow's length in an acre of land. A furrow is basically like a tilled row, more or less, within the land. And half that length, really a tilled row within an acre of land, more or less. So if you think of the acre, about half of that is where they killed 20 men right off the bat. That was that first strike that they had with them. And there was a panic in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. The garrison and even the raiders trembled. The earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. So they were panicking already. 20 of their men just got killed within half an acre by 2 guys. So they're already scared, and then the earth quaked. Yeah, God was giving them into their hand. Absolutely, he was. So the earth is shaking, and they are just scared as can be. They even start turning against each other. We'll see that in just a minute. And the watchmen of Saul and Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude was dispersing here and there. Then Saul said to the people who were with him, count, and see who has gone from us. And when they had counted, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. So Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God here. For the ark of God went at that time with the people of Israel. Remember, there was no temple set up at this time. That's what David wanted to do, wasn't able to do it. And then Solomon eventually finished the temple. And there's some real neat stuff that we'll get to with that. Looking forward to that, so stick around. But the ark went with the people of Israel at this time. Verse 19, now when Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the camp of the Philistines increased more and more. They're more panicked. They're getting more scared. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and went into the battle. And behold, every Philistine sword was against his fellow, and there was very great confusion. A lot of confusion going on in the camp of the Philistines. God is coming in there and really just putting it to him, because 600 people were not going to be able to overcome all the Philistines strictly on a physical, man-centered level. This had to take an act of God to come in here. And he did. So there was very great confusion. Verse 21. Now the Hebrews who had been with the Philistines before that time, and who had gone up with them into the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. Yeah, so there were Hebrews that went and joined the Philistines. Probably straight practical standpoint. Look, we can't defeat them. We see we can't defeat them. They're not even letting us have our own swords or anything like that. We're going to go join them, right? That seems to be the way to do it, isn't it? If you can't beat them, join them. That's conventional wisdom. God says, if you can't beat it, you trust me. Let me do it. In fact, even if you could beat it, just let me do it, God says, because then you'll start trusting in yourself. And eventually there's going to come a day where we can't overcome something, and we have to have God there to help us. We have to have God to bring us through and fight for us. And know that if God wants it to be so, then it's going to be so. And just trust him in it. So, we see that these Hebrews, they came and turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. Likewise, when all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were fleeing, they too followed hard after them in battle. That's great. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Beth-aven. A quick note on those Israelites that had joined the Philistines and came back. Those Israelites that had ran and hid and then came back. Think of the parables that Jesus told about the lost sheep, the lost coin, the prodigal son. In those situations, you had, say there was like the lost coin. I would kind of liken that to those Israelites who had gone and hid themselves. Yeah, they might have been scared, but then they came out eventually. And they came back to be with the rest of the people of Israel who were fighting and who were standing strong and staying there in the battle. But that lost coin never ceased to be a coin. In fact, that lost coin was a coin from the beginning, and it was part of the owner's coins from the very beginning. That woman swept and swept until she finally found the coin, and she rejoiced greatly when that coin came back. That lost coin was not representative of an unbeliever, but of a believer. Like in this case, if you're thinking about the Israelites, the people of God, not people who were outside, but people who were inside and then lost their way somehow. Same thing for the sheep. The sheep went astray, lost his way. Maybe went out and hid, maybe went out to join other people or other sheep somewhere else. But that shepherd is the good shepherd, and that shepherd kept looking for those sheep. That sheep was always a sheep. That sheep wasn't someone who became a sheep. In other words, that sheep represents a believer who has lost their way. And Christ goes and searches for them and brings them back. And he says there's more rejoicing in heaven over one of those who've lost their way than all the righteous. Our response should be the same. It can be so easy to keep those grudges and to hold ill will against people that we've seen walk away, people that we've seen be so strong in the faith, or just fellow believers who don't quite seem to get it yet. But when they come back, instead of being like that prodigal son's brother, remember the prodigal son was always a son. He never wasn't a son. He went and he squandered his entire inheritance. And when he came back, he didn't have that inheritance anymore, but he was still a son, and the father rejoiced to have him back. And his brother, what was the response? Ugh, that guy that did all that stuff, that ran away, went and joined the Philistines in battle instead. But our response should be rejoicing. When we see someone come back into fellowship with God, with the rest of the church, with other believers, our response should be to rejoice with God, to rejoice with heaven and the angels in heaven that this believer has come back, and accept them back and encourage them. It does not say here whether or not the people did that with these Israelites who had walked away. I hope they did. I really hope they did. I hope there was a lot of rejoicing, because as we see in verse 23, the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Beth-Aven. There was great victory that day, and there should only have been rejoicing. No ill will. If there are consequences to be had, there are consequences to be had. But those Israelites are still Israelites. Those Hebrews are still Hebrews. Believers are still believers. And we should accept them back every time with open arms and with great rejoicing. Now we're going to see more about where Saul starts to fall away, even in the midst of these great victories. Again, he'll start looking at himself instead of to God, who he should be looking at. And as disappointing as that may be, we need to keep in mind the same thing can happen to us. If we start to look inward, then if you're anything like me, you're going to find your insecurity. Now with Saul, it even starts to turn into pride, a sense of pride when he does have certain accomplishments, when God gives him victories. That's the same thing I'm sure that could happen to me as well. When God gives me victories, oh, there's a sense of pride. I can do that thing on my own, sure. But the important thing is that whatever we do it trusting God. God is with us. He'll let it succeed. He'll let it fail. He'll redirect our steps. A man plans his way, but it's the Lord that directs his steps. And he'll redirect us. But we also have to do. We have to do what our hand finds to do. Think of what Paul said, that I strive harder than any of them, yet not me, but Christ in me. I'm doing the work, but I'm trusting God. I'm trusting God in it. And there's a great freedom in that. That frees me up to work hard. That frees me up to do things. That frees me up to not have to look at what the result might be or if people will accept it or not. Because now it's up to God. It's up to God to determine, is this going to continue or is this not going to continue? And I'm free to just do and continue on from there. So next time, we'll take a look at Saul and see some more of his downfall, where things start to become official. Thanks.